The reading I'm about to share with you is an excerpt from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. This particular passage, for those of you who are not familiar with the context of the letter, Dr. King had been imprisoned in Birmingham during the nonviolent campaign in Birmingham after the authorities in Birmingham had turned dogs and fire hoses on children. And Dr. King wrote this letter in response to an article that had been written by some liberal, moderate white pastors urging the movement to stop, that this was not the right time, that this kind of troublemaking would make things worse. So Dr. King, while sitting in his prison cell, wrote this. The contemporary church is often a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. In the midst of blatant injustices, I have watched churches stand on the sideline and merely mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. More often than not, the church is an arch supporter of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure is consoled by the church's silent and often vocal sanction of things as they are. So the great question is this: is organized religion too inextricably bound to the status quo to save our nation and the world? Will the contemporary church be a strong ally for justice, or will it remain silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., letter from Birmingham jail. So before I start my sermon, I just want to say that that particular passage has resided at the center of my spiritual life, and especially my ministry as a Unitarian Universalist minister ever since I encountered it. The question at the end: will the church be a strong ally for justice or remain silent behind the security of stained glass windows? That question challenges me, inspires me, and at those times when I quite frankly have remained silent, it haunts me. And so I just wanted to say and acknowledge that that these words right here to me are always raising questions and raising a challenge that all congregations, but especially a congregation like this one, should be reflecting on and responding to. So let me begin. April the 7th, 1943. A young Lutheran minister is arrested and imprisoned in Berlin on suspicion of being connected to a plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler. He is an accomplished preacher and teacher, theologian, and writer. Since the Nazi Party's rise to power 10 years earlier, he has tirelessly sought to convince his fellow Christians to actively resist the fascist regime and especially persecution of the Jews. Unfortunately, his courageous words and actions are, for the most part, unheeded, as the vast majority of German churches actively support or remain silent about the Nazi regime and its actions. This young minister eventually joins the organized resistance movement, which leads to his arrest and imprisonment in April of 1943, and 2 years later, he is tragically executed at the young age of 39. Fast forward 20 years, April the 16th, 1963. Another minister sits in a narrow jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama. Over the past 8 years, he has led a nonviolent resistance movement seeking to end racial segregation across the American South. He is also an accomplished preacher and writer, and a few months after his release from jail, he will deliver what is perhaps the greatest speech in the history of this country. After being released from that jail cell and delivering that famous speech, the young minister leads the civil rights movement for another 5 years until he is tragically assassinated, also at the young age of 39. Now, although coming from very different backgrounds and having very different life experiences, the journeys of the German pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the African-American civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. share a great deal in common. They were both Christian ministers, scholars, and activists. They were both thrust into the leadership of movements that opposed powerful forces rooted in hate, oppression, and violence. And they both articulated and courageously acted on a vision of religion and religious community that demanded resistance to an unjust status quo, rather than the passivity that so often characterizes religious communities who, unfortunately, tend to prefer to remain silent behind those stained glass windows. Now, resistance, this idea of resistance, is certainly a word one has heard a great deal in Unitarian Universalism over the last decade. I don't think I'm going out on an interpretive limb here to suggest that the results of the 2016 election galvanized many in our faith to oppose and challenge actions and policies that harmed so many and that continue to threaten the future of democracy. And with another election looming in the fall that may prove to be the most consequential in the history of this nation, I'm imagining that resistance will once again move to the forefront of Unitarian Universalism. So I want to take a few minutes this morning to explore with you the idea of resistance and to ask what exactly it means for a religious community to resist. Is resistance a product of the results of the latest election or the party affiliation of the current administration? Or is there something deeper in the fabric of Unitarian Universalism that is always calling us to resist and transform the status quo, no matter who occupies the Oval Office or what political party has a majority in Congress or the state legislature or the governor's mansion? And answering that question takes us back well before 2016, really all the way back to the beginnings of Unitarian Universalism almost 500 years ago. Let's think for a moment about how this tradition of ours got started. Many of you know, of course, that we started out as two traditions, Unitarianism and Universalism. Unitarianism emerged out of an argument, a theological dispute that within Christianity at the time about the nature of God, a dispute that led Unitarians to affirm the unity, that's where the name comes from, or the oneness of God. That affirmation provoked a pretty significant backlash, and some of our Unitarian forebears were branded as heretics, and some were killed and imprisoned for their beliefs. And I think it was that experience of religiously inspired oppression, and even violence that led the Unitarian side of our tradition to embrace values like freedom, reason, and tolerance at its core, and to resist efforts to deny those rights, not only to Unitarians, but to all people. The Universalists began in a somewhat similar fashion. They rejected the theology of Calvinism, which saw God as a harsh judge who divides the human family into the saved and the unsaved. The Universalists saw, on the other hand, God as a loving parent who welcomes and saves all people, no matter who they are, where they come from, or what they believe. This led the Universalists to embrace unconditional love as their core religious value, a love that knows no bounds and that belongs to the whole human family. While both the Unitarians and the Universalists could have chosen to remain primarily inwardly focused, and there were certainly times when they did, from the beginning, Unitarian Universalism has never been simply about us and what goes on in congregations like this. Not that we have sought to proselytize or to insist that everyone should be a Unitarian Universalist. In fact, just the opposite has been the case. With few exceptions, Unitarian Universalism has always celebrated religious pluralism and freedom of conscience, and has resisted efforts to impose one dogma or creed on society as a whole. But our commitments to religious freedom and unconditional love have not been simply pious words leading us to be passive in the face of injustice or to remain silent behind the safety of stained glass windows. Think for a moment about the Unitarians and Universalists who resisted slavery, who struggled for the rights of women, who stood courageously against war and capital punishment, who risked their lives to help liberate victims of Nazi persecution and genocide during the Second World War, and who marched for civil rights and marriage equality. In one critical moment after another, Unitarian Universalists have answered the call to struggle for a more just and peaceful world. So I think there is little doubt that this idea of resistance is indeed built into the very fabric of Unitarian Universalism, that we find ourselves living in one of those critical moments when we must put our values into action. Speaking for myself, I can't remember a time when our country felt so divided and when hate and fear and exclusion have seemed to play such a prominent role in public life. And as is so often the case, that hatred and exclusion are most often directed at those who are marginalized by society. People of color, women, immigrants, religious minorities, the LGBTQ community, and so many others. But as Dr. King, Bonhoeffer, and so many of our Unitarian Universalist forebears have made clear, in times like these, people of faith have a religious and moral responsibility to say enough. We have a responsibility to resist those voices calling us to hate our neighbor rather than loving and welcoming them. We have a responsibility to resist those voices calling us to care only about ourselves and our own privilege while ignoring the oppression and suffering of others. And we most certainly have a responsibility to resist those voices calling us to let bitterness and resentment be our guides rather than love and compassion. So what does resistance look like in a congregation like the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Charlottesville? Well, first and foremost, I think resistance means that we must always be a community that strives to be as our mission says so well, a safe and welcoming place for all. In a world in which so many are being told that who they are is unacceptable and even illegal, that their lives and their voices don't matter, and that past and present injustices need to be erased from history rather than acknowledged and addressed, congregations like this one must live our Unitarian Universalist values every day and in everything we do. Now, while resistance often takes the form of what one might call social activism, our congregation must also resist by being a place of healing and hope, pluralism and diversity, exploration and curiosity. Again, we live in a world that feels so often like it's going in the wrong direction, that feels so filled with hate and exclusion and stress and anxiety. I, for one, can tell you how easy it is for me to get dragged down by all the toxic and hurtful things that fill our political climate, sometimes our religious climate. I oftentimes find myself getting angry by what others are saying and feeling stressed out and anxious. Sometimes even taking that stress and anxiety out on others who are just being who they are. And it's just so unhealthy and so toxic. I struggle on a daily basis as well. And I sometimes find myself with all this toxicity, just wanting to bury my head in the sand. Don't talk about politics. Don't think about it. Just try to go like this. And I think those tendencies to let our own selves, our own best selves, be dragged down by toxic culture is why that's one of the most important reasons why a congregation like this one can resist by always being a community where mind, heart, body, and spirit can find healing, rest, and renewal. In the struggle to resist, we can easily lose sight of just how important it is to attend to our own well-being and to create spaces for peace and silence, spirit and wholeness. If people of goodwill are to resist what's going on out there, we must give ourselves permission to find peace and joy in here and in here. And finally, we must answer Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther King Jr.'s call by having the courage to move beyond these walls to resist an unjust status quo. That kind of resistance isn't easy, and it can be risky and even harmful, as the residents of Charlottesville well know from the acts of violence and, yes, terrorism that visited our city in 2017. But resistance most certainly requires that we take risks, act boldly, and challenge injustice. As Dr. King said, there are times when communities of faith and conscience must oppose injustice, which he defined as those structures and policies that degrade and damage human personality and human dignity. In similar fashion, Bonhoeffer argued that organized religion is required not simply to offer comfort to the victims of injustice, but also, in his powerful words, when the wheels of injustice are turning faster and faster, sometimes organized religion needs to, as he said it, jam a spoke in the wheel of power and domination by actively defying those forces perpetuating it. Now, at this point, I can imagine some of you may be thinking that this whole resistance business sounds pretty stressful and uncomfortable, and it can be. But I want to say that in my experience and in the experience of many Unitarian Universalists who have lived their faith by challenging injustice and by following a courageous path of love and compassion, there is something about resistance, something about speaking up and speaking out and showing up that enriches one's own life and renews one's sense of purpose and meaning. I think back, for example, to the Unitarian Universalists who answered Dr. King's call to come to Selma in 1965 to march for voting rights, including, I might add, the minister of this congregation, Roy Jones. While fear and danger were certainly prevalent, according to Mark Morrison Reed, one of our best Unitarian Universalist historians, according to his wonderful book on Selma, in the aftermath, many of the UUs who went to Selma looked back on their experience as the high point of their lives, and as a time when they truly felt they were living their Unitarian Universalist values and principles. To borrow a lovely phrase from the great Quaker writer Parker Palmer, resistance can be a moment when, as Palmer says, soul and role come into alignment and are in harmony with one another. And resistance is not all about being on the front lines or devoting all of one's time to social activism. Resistance is about truly living one's faith, or as we might say in Unitarian Universalism, living into the fullness of one's UU values. In a world in which language and behavior grow increasingly toxic and divisive, resistance is indeed about creating space for beauty, joy, and healing. In a world that is so often characterized by my way or the highway, or us versus them, resistance is about living every day with humility, deep listening, and openness. And in a world that continues to try and pretend that oppression and the climate crisis are fake news or part of some woke ideology, resistance means courageously telling the truth and speaking honestly about ourselves, about our values and principles, and about a vision of a world of equity, justice, and peace for all people and for the planet, which our current mission says so well. Now, as you heard earlier, in a few minutes, we will gather here in the sanctuary and online for our congregational meeting. And one of the key items on the agenda is approval of our long-range plan, whose purpose is to enable us to live our mission. I am so proud of the hard work that has gone into developing this plan. The task force has spent the last 6 months listening and learning and has done a wonderful job, and so many of you contributed your ideas and your input. Let me simply say that I believe this plan that you will be voting on in a few minutes will provide our congregation with the goals, the focus, and the accountability we will need to live our mission and to put our congregation's soul in harmony with our role and our mission. Together, we can and we must put love into action and be a community of healing and hope, not only for ourselves, but for all people and for the planet. Friends, I cannot wait to begin this journey with all of you, because together we can resist with joy and make such a positive difference. Amen, and blessed be.